Now that we've covered the first group of German pioneers, let's take a look at the father of psychology, Wilhelm Wundt. In the mid to late 1800s, Wundt began to make his mark on the field of psychology. Most historians consider Wundt to be the world's first true psychologist, as well as the founder of psychology. And I will tell you a little bit more about the defining moment, the moment that historians consider to be the birth of psychology. I will tell you about that in just a few minutes. He attended medical school in the 1850s and earned his MD from the University of Heidelberg, but he never actually ends up practicing medicine. Instead, his goal was to establish a new type of science. He was influenced by Robert Bunsen, the inventor of the Bunsen burner. He studied experimental physiology with Johannes Müller, and he also worked with Helmholtz in his lab for some time. For most of his career, Wundt taught physiology courses at several German universities. After working with Helmholtz in his research lab, he began teaching at the University of Heidelberg, where he had earned his MD and where he taught the first scientific psychology course. I put scientific psychology in air quotes because it wasn't really scientific psychology as we know it today. It was more of a physiology class than anything. Then in 1874, he started teaching at the University of Zurich. He was not happy there and moved to the University of Leipzig in 1875. It was at this university that he conducted his most famous work. Wundt is considered the father of psychology because he promoted it more than anyone else. He did this in a variety of ways, and we're going to cover some of those strategies he used to spread the word about scientific psychology. In 1873 and 1874, he published the world's first psychology textbook, Principles of Physiological Psychology. At the time, the word physiological meant experimental. We really didn't have a word for experiments at the time, so the word physiological means the same thing at the time in Germany. In his book, he urged researchers to apply the scientific method used in the physical sciences to psychology. He believed that some of the similar methods and procedures might prove useful in psychology. Also in his book, he includes descriptions of anatomy, of the brain, its functions, the nervous system, and some of the characteristics of sensation and perception. Here are examples of some of Wundt's illustrations in this textbook. This one on the left is his illustration of Golgi's illustration, and this one on the right is his illustration of Cajal's illustration. So both of these nerve cell researchers were active and publishing their work. Wundt used their work in his own book. In the mid-1870s, sometime after he was hired at the University of Leipzig, he begins to collect equipment in a tiny room on campus. He initially collected this equipment to be used for teaching demonstrations. He would bring his students into the lab or sometimes bring the equipment to the classroom to show his students how different equipment could be used. But he didn't actually conduct any experiments just yet. He collected tachistoscopes, chronoscopes, sensory mapping devices, electrical stimulators, pendulums, and a variety of different timing devices. On the slide, you see two different examples of Wundt's equipment. These were actually used in Wundt's teaching demonstrations. You can find some of his equipment in museums and also on some really shady auction sites. It wasn't until 1879 that Wundt and his students began to conduct psychology experiments. In the beginning, they studied sensation and perception because Wundt did not believe that complex human experiences like problem solving, he did not think these higher mental processes could even be studied using experiments. So he and his studies stuck with sensation and perception, the more physiological aspects of psychology. Many historians consider this lab to be the first experimental psychology lab. 1879 is the date that many historians agree is the birth date of psychology. It is because this is the date when Wundt, the father of psychology, first began to conduct psychology experiments. Unfortunately, Wundt's lab was destroyed in World War II by Allied bombing. We did lose some of his original equipment and some of his lab notes. To collect information from his participants, Wundt relied on a procedure he called internal perception. This procedure would be adapted by some of his students and other pioneers in the field of psychology. Eventually, it is replaced by what we know today as scientific psychology. At the time, though, internal perception was experimental. This was as experimental as it got at the time. So what is internal perception? What is this method? He would bring participants into his lab. He would have them experience some type of stimuli, a light, a visual, a sound, and have them describe that experience, that stimuli, describe their sensation and perception as it occurred. So as they're listening to this sound, his participants are describing what they're hearing and how they're hearing it. Eventually, this method becomes Edward Titchener's experimental introspection. Here's a picture of Wundt in 1880 sitting in the chair surrounded by his students in his lab. One of the reasons Wundt is considered the father of psychology, and one of the reasons he was so popular at the time, is because he was dedicated to his students. Throughout his career, he supervised 186 dissertations. That is impressive. At SIUE, a PhD professor might supervise a handful, 3 or 4 dissertations each year. Wundt was supervising at the time double, triple this number. He supervised Hall, Cattell, Kreplin, Munsterberg, Kolpe, Titchener, Spearman. These are big names in psychology, and he supervised all of their dissertations. This is important because his students, his PhD students, would then go out into the world, go back to the United States, go back to their home in Europe. They would take his ideas with them. He ended up training over 36 American psychologists. Many of his doctoral students ended up establishing their own experimental psychology labs, academic journals, and even bachelor and master's programs in psychology at other universities. So again, one of the reasons he is so influential is because he influenced his students, who then influenced others.